near to starving in the following weeks, I was hardly ever without a roof. It was now absolutely necessary to find work, and I remembered a friend of mine, a Russian waiter named Boris, who might be able to help me. I'd first met him in the public ward of a hospital, where he was being treated for arthritis in the left leg. He'd told me to come to him if I were ever in difficulties. I must say something about Boris, for he was a curious character and my close friend for a long time. He was a big, soldierly man of about 35, and had been good-looking, but since his illness he had grown immensely fat from lying in bed. Like most Russian refugees, he had had an adventurous life. His parents, killed in the revolution, had been rich people, and he had served through the war in the 2nd Siberian Rifles, which, according to him, was the best regiment in the Russian army. After the war, he had first worked in a brush factory, then as a porter at Les Halles, then had become a dishwasher, and had finally worked his way up to be a waiter. When he fell ill, he was at the Hotel Scribe, and was taking 100 francs a day in tips. His ambition was to become a maître d'hôtel, save 50,000 francs, and set up a small select restaurant on the right bank. Boris always talked of the war as the happiest time of his life. War and soldiering were his passion. He had read innumerable books of strategy and military history, and could tell you all about the theories of Napoleon, Kutuzov, Clausewitz, Moltke, and Foch. Anything to do with soldiers pleased him. His favourite café was the Closerie des Lilas in Montparnasse, simply because the statue of Marshal Ney stands outside it. Later on, Boris and I sometimes went to the Rue de Commerce together. If we went by metro, Boris always got out at Cambronne station instead of Commerce, though Commerce was nearer. He liked the association with General Cambronne, who was called on to surrender at Waterloo, and answered simply, "Merde." The only things left to Boris by the revolution were his medals and some photographs of his old regiment. He'd kept these when everything else went to the pawn-shop. Almost every day he would spread the photographs out on the bed and talk about them. "Voilà, mon ami, there you see me at the head of my company, big fine man, eh? Not like these little rats of Frenchmen. A captain at 20, not bad, eh? Yes, a captain in the 2nd Siberian Rifles, and my father was a colonel. Ah, me, mon ami, the ups and downs of life. A captain in the Russian army, and then, piff, the revolution, every penny gone. In 1916, I stayed a week at the Hotel Edward VII. In 1920, I was trying for a job as night watchman there. I've been night watchman, cellarman, floor scrubber, dishwasher, porter, lavatory attendant. I have tipped waiters, and I have been tipped by waiters. But I have known what it is to live like a gentleman, mon ami. I do not say it to boast, but the other day I was trying to compute how many mistresses I have had in my life, and I made it out to be over 200. Yes, at least 200. Ah, well. Ça reviendra. Victory is to him who fights the longest. Courage! Etc., etc. Boris had a queer, changeable nature. He always wished himself back in the army, but he had also been a waiter long enough to acquire the waiter's outlook. Though he had never saved more than a few thousand francs, he took it for granted that in the end he would be able to set up his own restaurant and grow rich. All waiters, I afterwards found, talk and think of this. It is what reconciles them to being waiters. Boris used to talk interestingly about hotel life. "Waiting is a gamble," he used to say. "You may die poor, you may make your fortune in a year. You are not paid wages, you depend on tips, 10% of the bill, and the commission from the wine companies on champagne corks. Sometimes the tips are enormous. The barman at Maxim's, for instance, makes 500 francs a day. More than 500 in a season. I have made 200 francs a day myself. It was at a hotel in Biarritz in the season. The whole staff, from the manager down to the plongeurs, was working 21 hours a day. 21 hours work and 2.5 hours in bed for a month on end. Still, it was worth it, at 200 francs a day. You never know when the stroke of luck is coming. Once, when I was at the Hotel Royal, an American customer sent for me before dinner and ordered 24 brandy cocktails. I brought them all together on a tray in 24 glasses. "Now, garçon," said the customer, he was drunk, "I'll drink 12 and you drink 12, and if you can walk to the door afterwards, you get 100 francs. I walked to the door, and he gave me 100 francs. And every night, for 6 days, he did the same thing. 12 brandy cocktails, then 100 francs. A few months later, I heard he had been extradited by the American government, embezzlement. There is something fine, do you not think, about these Americans?" I liked Boris, and we had interesting times together playing chess and talking about war and hotels. Boris used often to suggest that I should become a waiter. "The life would suit you," he used to say. "When you are in work with 100 francs a day and a nice mistress, is not bad. You say you'll go in for writing. Writing is bosh. There is only one way to make money at writing, and that is to marry a publisher's daughter. But you would make a good waiter if you shaved that moustache off. You are tall, and you speak English. Those are the chief things a waiter needs. Wait till I can bend this accursed leg, mon ami, and then, if you are ever out of a job, come to me." Now that I was short of my rent and getting hungry, I remembered Boris's promise, and decided to look him up at once. I did not hope to become a waiter so easily as he had promised, but of course I knew how to scrub dishes, and no doubt he could get me a job in the kitchen. He had said that dishwashing jobs were to be had for the asking during the summer. It was a great relief to remember that I had, after all, one influential friend to fall back on. A short time before, Boris had given me an address in the Rue du Marché des Blancs-Manteaux. All he had said in his letter was that things were not marching too badly, and I assumed that he was back at the Hotel Scribe, touching his 100 francs a day. I was full of hope, and wondered why I'd been fool enough not to go to Boris before. I saw myself in a cosy restaurant, with jolly cooks singing love songs as they broke eggs into the pan, and 5 solid meals a day. I even squandered 2 francs 50 on a packet of Gauloise Bleu, in anticipation of my wages. In the morning I walked down to the Rue du Marché des Blancs-Manteaux. With a shock, I found it a slummy back street, as bad as my own. Boris's hotel was the dirtiest hotel in the street. From its dark doorway there came out a vile, sour odour, a mixture of slops and synthetic soup. It was bouillon zip, 25 centimes a packet. A misgiving came over me. People who drink bouillon zip are starving, or near it. Could Boris possibly be earning 100 francs a day? A surly patron sitting in the office said to me, yes, the Russian was at home in the attic. I went up 6 flights of narrow, winding stairs, the bouillon zip growing stronger as one got higher. Boris did not answer when I knocked at his door, so I opened it and went in. The room was an attic 10 feet square, lighted only by a skylight, its sole furniture a narrow iron bedstead, a chair, and a wash-hand stand with 1 game leg. A long S-shaped chain of bugs marched slowly across the wall above the bed. Boris was lying asleep, naked, his large belly making a mound under the grimy sheet. His chest was spotted with insect bites. As I came in, he woke up, rubbed his eyes, and groaned deeply. "Name of Jesus Christ," he exclaimed. "Oh, name of Jesus Christ, my back! Curse it! I believe my back is broken." "What's the matter?" I exclaimed. "My back is broken, that is all. I have spent the night on the floor. Oh, name of Jesus Christ! If you knew what my back feels like." "My dear Boris, are you ill?" "Not ill, only starving. Yes, starving to death if this goes on much longer. Besides sleeping on the floor, I have lived on 2 francs a day for weeks past. It is fearful. You have come at a bad moment, mon ami." It did not seem much use to ask whether Boris still had his job at the Hotel Scribe. I hurried downstairs and bought a loaf of bread. Boris threw himself on the bread and ate half of it, after which he felt better, sat up in bed, and told me what was the matter with him. He'd failed to get a job after leaving the hospital because he was still very lame, and he had spent all his money and pawned everything, and finally starved for several days. He had slept a week on the quay under the Pont d'Austerlitz, among some empty wine barrels. For the past fortnight he had been living in this room together with a Jew, a mechanic. It appeared, there was some complicated explanation, that the Jew owed Boris 300 francs, and was repaying this by letting him sleep on the floor and allowing him 2 francs a day for food. 2 francs would buy a bowl of coffee and 3 rolls. The Jew went to work at 7 in the mornings, and after that Boris would leave his sleeping place, it was beneath the skylight which let in the rain, and get into the bed. He could not sleep much even there, owing to the bugs, but it rested his back after the floor. It was a great disappointment when I'd come to Boris for help to find him even worse off than myself. I explained that I had only about 60 francs left, and must get a job immediately. By this time, however, Boris had eaten the rest of the bread, and was feeling cheerful and talkative. He said carelessly, "Good heavens, what are you worrying about? 60 francs? Why, it's a fortune. Please hand me that shoe, mon ami. I'm going to smash one of those bugs if they come within reach." "But do you think there's any chance of getting a job?" "Chance? It's a certainty. In fact, I have got something already. There is a new Russian restaurant which is to open in a few days in the Rue du Commerce. It is une chose entendue that I am to be maître d'hôtel. I can easily get you a job in the kitchen. 500 francs a month, and your food. Tips, too, if you're lucky." "But in the meantime, I've got to pay my rent before long."
"Oh, we shall find something. I've got a few cards up my sleeve. There are people who owe me money. For instance, Paris is full of them. One of them is bound to pay up before long. Then, think of all the women who have been my mistress. A woman never forgets, you know. I have only to ask, and they will help me. Besides, the Jew tells me he is going to steal some magnetos from the garage where he works, and he will pay us 5 francs a day to clean them before he sells them. That alone would keep us. Never worry, mon ami. Nothing is easier to get than money."
"Well, let's go out now and look for a job."
"Presently, mon ami. We shan't starve, don't you fear. This is only the fortune of war. I've been in a worse hole scores of times. It is only a question of persisting. Remember Fox's maxim, attaque, attaque, attaque."
It was midday before Boris decided to get up. All the clothes he now had left were one suit, with one shirt, collar and tie, a pair of shoes almost worn out, and a pair of socks, all holes. He had also an overcoat which was to be pawned in the last extremity. He had a suitcase, a wretched 20-franc cardboard thing, but very important, because the patron of the hotel believed that it was full of clothes. Without that, he would probably have turned Boris out of doors. What it actually contained were the medals and photographs, various odds and ends, and huge bundles of love letters. In spite of all this, Boris managed to keep a fairly smart appearance. He shaved without soap and with a razor blade 2 months old, tied his tie so that the holes did not show, and carefully stuffed the soles of his shoes with newspaper. Finally, when he was dressed, he produced an ink bottle and inked the skin of his ankles where it showed through his socks. You would never have thought, when it was finished, that he had recently been sleeping under the Seine bridges. We went to a small café off the Rue de Rivoli, a well-known rendezvous of hotel managers and employees. At the back was a dark, cave-like room where all kinds of hotel workers were sitting, smart young waiters, others not so smart and clearly hungry, fat pink cooks, greasy dishwashers, battered old scrubbing women. Everyone had an untouched glass of black coffee in front of him. The place was, in effect, an employment bureau, and the money spent on drinks was the patron's commission. Sometimes a stout, important-looking man, obviously a restaurateur, would come in and speak to the barman, and the barman would call to one of the people at the back of the cafe. But he never called to Boris or me, and we left after 2 hours, as the etiquette was that you could only stay 2 hours for one drink. We learned afterwards, when it was too late, that the dodge was to bribe the barman. If you could afford 20 francs, he would generally get you a job. We went to the Hotel Scribe and waited an hour on the pavement, hoping that the manager would come out, but he never did. Then we dragged ourselves down to the Rue de Commerce, only to find that the new restaurant, which was being redecorated, was shut up and the patron away. It was now night. We had walked 14 kilometres over pavement, and we were so tired that we had to waste 1 franc 50 on going home by metro. Walking was agony to Boris with his game leg, and his optimism wore thinner and thinner as the day went on. When we got out of the metro at the Place d'Italie, he was in despair. He began to say that it was no use looking for work. There was nothing for it but to try crime. "Sooner rob than starve, mon ami. I've often planned it. A fat, rich American, some dark corner down Montparnasse way, a cobblestone in a stocking, bang! And then you go through his pockets and bolt. It is feasible, do you not think? I would not flinch. I've been a soldier, remember." He decided against the plan in the end, because we were both foreigners and easily recognized. When we had got back to my room, we spent another 1 franc 50 on bread and chocolate. Boris devoured his share, and at once cheered up, like magic. Food seemed to act on his system as rapidly as a cocktail. He took out a pencil and began making a list of the people who would probably give us jobs. There were dozens of them, he said. "Tomorrow we shall find something, mon ami. I know it in my bones. The luck always changes. Besides, we both have brains. A man with brains can't starve." "What things a man can do with brains will make money out of anything. I had a friend once, a Pole, a real man of genius. And what do you think he used to do? He would buy a gold ring and pawn it for 15 francs. Then, you know how carelessly the clocks fill up the tickets. Where the clock had written en or, he would add a diamant, and he would change 15 francs to 15,000. Neat, eh? Then, you see, he could borrow 1,000 francs on the security of the ticket. That is what I mean by brains. For the rest of the evening, Boris was in a hopeful mood, talking of the times we should have together when we were waiters together at Nice or Biarritz, with smart rooms and enough money to set up mistresses. He was too tired to walk the 3 kilometres back to his hotel, and slept the night on the floor of my room, with his coat rolled round his shoes for a pillow. We again failed to find work the next day, and it was 3 weeks before the luck changed. My 200 francs saved me from trouble about the rent, but everything else went as badly as possible. Day after day, Boris and I went up and down Paris, drifting at 2 miles an hour through the crowds, bored and hungry, and finding nothing. One day, I remember, we crossed the Seine 11 times. We loitered for hours outside service doorways, and when the manager came out, we would go up to him ingratiatingly, cap in hand. We always got the same answer. They did not want a lame man, nor a man without experience. Once we were very nearly engaged. While he spoke to the manager, Boris stood straight upright, not supporting himself with his stick, and the manager did not see that he was lame. "Yes," he said, "we want 2 men in the cellars. Perhaps you would come inside." Then Boris moved, and the game was up. "Ah," said the manager, "you limp, malheureusement." We enrolled our names at agencies and answered advertisements, but walking everywhere made us slow, and we seemed to miss every job by half an hour. Once we very nearly got a job swabbing out railway trucks, but at the last moment they rejected us in favour of Frenchmen. Once we answered an advertisement calling for hands at a circus. You had to shift benches and clean up litter, and during the performance stand on 2 tubs and let a lion jump through your legs. When we got to the place, an hour before the time named, we found a queue of 50 men already waiting. There is some attraction in lions, evidently. Once an agency to which I had applied months earlier sent me a petit bleu, telling me of an Italian gentleman who wanted English lessons. The petit bleu said, "Come at once," and promised 20 francs an hour. Boris and I were in despair. Here was a splendid chance, and I could not take it, for it was impossible to go to the agency with my coat out at elbow. Then it occurred to us that I could wear Boris's coat. It did not match my trousers, but the trousers were grey and might pass for flannel at a short distance. The coat was so much too big for me that I had to wear it unbuttoned and keep one hand in my pocket. I hurried out and wasted 75 centimes on a bus fare to get to the agency. When I got there, I found that the Italian had changed his mind and left Paris. Once Boris suggested that I should go to Les Halles and try for a job as a porter. I arrived at 4:30 in the morning, when the work was getting into its swing. Seeing a short fat man in a bowler hat directing some porters, I went up to him and asked for work. Before answering, he seized my right hand and felt the palm. "You're strong, eh?" he said. "Very strong," I said untruly. "Bien, let me see you lift that crate." It was a huge wicker basket full of potatoes. I took hold of it and found that, so far from lifting it, I could not even move it. The man in the bowler hat watched me, then shrugged his shoulders and turned away. I made off. When I had gone some distance, I looked back and saw 4 men lifting the basket onto a cart. It weighed 300 weight, possibly. The man had seen that I was no use and taken this way of getting rid of me. Sometimes, in his hopeful moments, Boris spent 50 centimes on a stamp and wrote to one of his ex-mistresses asking for money. Only one of them ever replied. It was a woman who, besides having been his mistress, owed him 200 francs. When Boris saw the letter waiting and recognized the handwriting, he was wild with hope. We seized the letter and rushed up to Boris's room to read it, like a child with stolen sweets. Boris read the letter, then handed it silently to me. It ran, "My little cherished wolf, with what delight did I open thy charming letter, reminding me of the days of our perfect love, and of the so dear kisses which I have received from thy lips. Such memories linger forever in the heart, like the perfume of a flower that is dead. As to thy request for 200 francs, alas, it is impossible. Thou dost not know, my dear one, how I am desolated to hear of thy embarrassments. But what wouldst thou? In this life which is so sad, trouble comes to every one. I too have had my share. My little sister has been ill. Ah, the poor little one, how she suffered, and we are obliged to pay I know not what to the doctor. All our money is gone, and we are passing, I assure thee, very difficult days. Courage, my little wolf, always, the courage. Remember that the bad days are not forever, and the trouble which seems so terrible will disappear at last. Rest assured, my dear one, that I will remember thee always, and receive the most sincere embraces of her who has never ceased to love thee, thy Yvonne." This letter disappointed Boris so much that he went straight to bed, and would not look for work again that day. My 60 francs lasted about a fortnight. I had given up the pretence of going out to restaurants, and we used to eat in my room, one of us sitting on the bed and the other on the chair. Boris would contribute his 2 francs, and I 3 or 4 francs, and we would buy bread, potatoes, milk and cheese, and make soup over my spirit lamp. We had a saucepan and a coffee bowl and 1 spoon. Every day there was a polite squabble as to who should eat out of the saucepan and who out of the coffee bowl. The saucepan held more, and every day, to my secret anger, Boris gave in first and had the saucepan. Sometimes we had more bread in the evening, sometimes not. Our linen was getting filthy, and it was 3 weeks since I had had a bath. Boris, so he said, had not had a bath for months. It was tobacco that made everything tolerable. We had plenty of tobacco, for some time before Boris had met a soldier. The the soldiers had given their tobacco free and bought 20 or 30 packets at 50 centimes each. All this was far worse for Boris than for me. The walking and sleeping on the floor kept his leg and back in constant pain, and with his vast Russian appetite he suffered torments of hunger, though he never seemed to grow thinner. On the whole, he was surprisingly gay, and he had vast capacities for hope. He used to say seriously that he had a patron saint who watched over him, and when things were very bad, he would search the gutter for money, saying that the saint often dropped a 2-franc piece there. One day, we were waiting in the Rue Royale. There was a Russian restaurant nearby, and we were going to ask for a job there. Suddenly, Boris made up his mind to go into the Madeleine and burn a 50-centime candle to his patron saint. Then, coming out, he said that he would be on the safe side, and solemnly put a match to a 50-centime stamp, as a sacrifice to the immortal gods. Perhaps the gods and the saints did not get on together. At any rate, we missed the job. On some mornings, Boris collapsed in the most utter despair. He would lie in bed almost weeping, cursing the Jew with whom he lived. Of late, the Jew had become restive about paying the daily 2 francs, and what was worse, had begun putting on intolerable airs of patronage. Boris said that I, as an Englishman, could not conceive what torture it was to a Russian of family to be at the mercy of a Jew. "A Jew, mon ami, a veritable Jew, and he hasn't even the decency to be ashamed of it. To think that I, a captain in the Russian army— have I ever told you, mon ami, that I was a captain in the 2nd Siberian Rifles? Yes, a captain, and my father was a colonel, and here I am, eating the bread of a Jew. A Jew. I will tell you what the Jews are like. Once, in the early months of the war, we were on the march, and we had halted at a village for the night. A horrible old Jew with a red beard like Judas Iscariot came sneaking up to my billet. I asked him what he wanted. "Your Honor," he said, "I have brought you a girl for you, a beautiful young girl, only 17. It will only be 50 francs. "Thank you," I said. "You can take her away again. I don't want to catch any diseases." "Diseases?" cried the Jew. "Mais, monsieur le capitaine, there's no fear of that. It's my own daughter." That is the Jewish national character for you. Have I ever told you, mon ami, that in the old Russian army it was considered bad form to spit on a Jew? Yes. We thought a Russian officer's spittle was too precious to be wasted on Jews, etc., etc. On these days Boris usually declared himself too ill to go out and look for work. He would lie till evening in the greyish, verminous sheets, smoking and reading old newspapers. Sometimes we played chess. We had no board, but we wrote down the moves on a piece of paper, and afterwards we made a board from the side of a packing case, and a set of men from Buttons, Belgian coins, and the like. Boris, like many Russians, had a passion for chess. It was a saying of his that the rules of chess are the same as the rules of love and war, and that if you can win at one, you can win at the others. But he also said that if you have a chessboard, you do not mind being hungry, which was certainly not true in my case. My money oozed away, to 8 francs, to 4 francs, to 1 franc, to 25 centimes. And 25 centimes is useless, for it will buy nothing except a newspaper. We went several days on dry bread, and then I was 2.5 days with nothing to eat whatever. This was an ugly experience. There are people who do fasting cures of 3 weeks or more, and they say that fasting is quite pleasant after the 4th day. I do not know, never having gone beyond the third day. Probably it seems different when one is doing it voluntarily and is not underfed at the start. The first day, too inert to look for work, I borrowed a rod and went fishing in the Seine, baiting with blue bottles. I hoped to catch enough for a meal, but of course I did not. The Seine is full of dace, but they grew cunning during the siege of Paris, and none of them has been caught since, except in nets. On the second day I thought of pawning my overcoat, but it seemed too far to walk to the pawn shop, and I spent the day in bed, reading the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. It was all that I felt equal to, without food. Hunger reduces one to an utterly spineless, brainless condition, more like the after-effects of influenza than anything else. It is as though one had been turned into a jellyfish, or as though all one's blood had been pumped out and lukewarm water substituted. Complete inertia is my chief memory of hunger, that and being obliged to spit very frequently, and the spittle being curiously white and flocculent, like a cuckoo spit. I do not know the reason for this, but everyone who has gone hungry several days has noticed it. On the third morning I felt very much better. I realized that I must do something at once, and I decided to go and ask Boris to let me share his 2 francs, at any rate for a day or two. When I arrived, I found Boris in bed, and furiously angry. As soon as I came in, he burst out, almost choking. "He has taken it back, the dirty thief! He has taken it back!" "Who's taken what?" I said. "The Jew. Taken my 2 francs, the dog, the thief! He robbed me in my sleep." It appeared that on the previous night the Jew had flatly refused to pay the daily 2 francs. They had argued, and at last the Jew had consented to hand over the money. He had done it, Boris said, in the most offensive manner, making a little speech about how kind he was and extorting abject gratitude. And then, in the morning, he had stolen the money back before Boris was awake. This was a blow. I was horribly disappointed, for I had allowed my belly to expect food, a great mistake when one is hungry. However, rather to my surprise, Boris was far from despairing. He sat up in bed, lighted his pipe, and reviewed the situation. "Now, listen, mon ami, this is a tight corner. We have only 25 centimes between us, and I don't suppose the Jew will ever pay my 2 francs again. In any case, his behavior is becoming intolerable. Will you believe it? The other night he had the indecency to bring a woman in here while I was there on the floor, the low animal. And I have a worse thing to tell you. The Jew intends clearing out of here. He owes a week's rent, and his idea is to avoid paying that and give me the slip at the same time. If the Jew shoots the moon, I shall be left without a roof, and the patron will take my suitcase in lieu of rent, curse him. We have got to make a vigorous move." "All right, but what can we do? It seems to me that the only thing is to pawn our overcoats and get some food."
"We'll do that, of course, but I must get my possessions out of this house first. To think of my photographs being seized. Well, my plan is ready. I am going to forestall the Jew and shoot the moon myself. Foutre le camp. Retreat, you understand? I think that is the correct move, huh?"
"But, my dear Boris, how can you in daytime? You're bound to be caught."
Well, it will need strategy, of course. Our patron is on the watch for people slipping out without paying their rent. He's been had that way before. He and his wife take it in turns all day to sit in the office. What misers, these Frenchmen! But I have thought of a way to do it, if you will help.
I did not feel in a very helpful mood, but I asked Boris what his plan was. He explained it carefully.
"Now, listen. We must start by pawning our overcoats. First, go back to your room and fetch your overcoat, then come back here and fetch mine, and smuggle it out under cover of yours. Take them to the pawn shop in the Rue de Franc-Bourgeois. You ought to get 20 francs for 2, with luck. Then go down to the Seine bank and fill your pockets with stones, and bring them back and put them in my suitcase. You see the idea? I shall wrap as many of my things as I can carry in a newspaper, and go down and ask the patron the way to the nearest laundry. I shall be very brazen and casual, you understand? And of course the patron will think the bundle is nothing but dirty linen. Or, if he does suspect anything, he will do what he always does, the mean sneak. He will go up to my room and feel the weight of my suitcase. And when he feels the weight of stones, he will think it is still full. Strategy, eh? Then afterwards I can come back and carry my other things out in my pockets.
But what about the suitcase?
Oh, that we shall have to abandon it. The miserable thing only cost 20 francs. Besides, one always abandons something in a retreat. Look at Napoleon at Beresina. He abandoned his whole army.
Boris was so pleased with this scheme, he called it une ruse de guerre, that he almost forgot being hungry. Its main weakness, that he would have nowhere to sleep after shooting the moon, he ignored. At first, the ruse de guerre worked well. I went home and fetched my overcoat, that made already 9 kilometres on an empty belly, and smuggled Boris's coat out successfully. Then a hitch occurred. The receiver at the pawn-shop, a nasty, sour-faced, interfering little man, a typical French official,